It is June 25, 1876, and the ridgeline above the Little Bighorn River is about to kill everyone on it. Sergeant John Ryan of the 7th Cavalry knows what a Sioux volley sounds like. He knows it very well now, because it has been coming from 3 sides for the last 20 minutes, out of brush and coulees and ravines where nobody had seen anyone standing. His men work their Springfield trapdoors, flip the breech block up, extract the spent case, seat a new .45-70 cartridge, close and fire. 1 shot, then work the action again. They are well-drilled soldiers. That is not the problem. The problem is the rate of incoming fire from the opposite side, which is nothing like what military doctrine said they should be facing. The men facing them have Winchesters, Henry repeaters, Spencer carbines captured in earlier fights. And the .45-70 trapdoor, for all its power at distance, is a single-shot rifle designed for a kind of fight that is not happening in these hills today. This is not a story about a round that failed. It is a story about a round the Army kept long after it should have been finished. And why, 150 years after it was first loaded into a brass case and called regulation, the United States military is still buying it. The .45-70 government cartridge was developed in 1873 at Springfield Armory. It replaced the .50-70, which the Army had been using since the Civil War as a stopgap. The new round carried a .45 caliber bullet, actually 4.58 inches at the groove diameter, propelled by 70 grains of black powder behind a 405 grain lead projectile. At the muzzle, it was traveling roughly 1,350 feet per second. That is slow by modern standards, with the arcing trajectory typical of heavy black powder cartridges. What it was enormous. At any range inside 300 yards, a 405 grain lead ball at that velocity struck with heavy, close-range authority. The Army liked this. The Army believed this was the point. And for the war, they thought they were going to fight linear volleys, open ground, infantry in formation. They were completely right. The problem was the war they actually fought. The U.S. Army Ordnance Board in the early 1870s was not staffed with fools. They'd spent a decade watching the Civil War transform infantry tactics, and they believed they had understood the lesson. The muzzleloader was finished. Breech-loading rifles were the future. Accuracy at range, real range, 500 yards and beyond, was the decisive advantage. The .45-70 in the trapdoor Springfield could reach out to 1,000 yards for volley fire, and the Army trained its men to use calibrated iron sights and know their holdovers. The rear sight on the Springfield Model 1884 had a flip-up long-range leaf with precise elevation adjustments because the Army expected its men to be shooting at formed enemy infantry across measured distances. The cartridge was powerful enough to knock a target down at distance, and simple enough to be issued to poorly educated conscripts without logistical catastrophe. There was another reason the board chose a single-shot design over the Winchester and Spencer repeaters already on the market. Ammunition. A soldier with a repeating rifle will shoot it. A soldier with a repeating rifle under stress will shoot it faster than resupply can follow. The Army had watched men burn through ammunition at Gettysburg and Chickamauga and every major engagement of the war. And their conclusion was not that soldiers needed more ammunition. Their conclusion was that soldiers needed controlled fire. Slow, aimed, devastating. The single-shot trapdoor forced discipline. 1 round, make it count. This thinking was not unusual. The major European armies of the same period arrived at almost identical conclusions. The British were fielding single-shot Martini Henrys. The Prussians had the Dreyse, and then the Mauser bolt-action single-loaders. Everyone who had studied the wars of the 1860s and 1870s agreed on the same fundamental truth. A disciplined soldier with an accurate, powerful single-shot rifle, firing at a known range, was the backbone of modern infantry. Volume of fire was an amateur's answer. Precision was the professional one. On paper, this was sound doctrine. The .45-70 trapdoor was nearly perfect, on flat ground, against an enemy who stood in the open and came at you in a recognizable formation. It was simple to maintain. The ammunition was interchangeable across the entire force. In that .45 caliber projectile, nearly half an inch wide, hit with the kind of authority that settled arguments at short range. But the Army's doctrine had been written for a war against soldiers who fought the same way the Army did. The frontier was not that war. Against Lakota and Cheyenne and Ojibwe fighters who had spent their entire lives reading terrain, who moved through cover at speed, who chose their engagements at 50 yards instead of 500, the single-shot trapdoor's measured fire doctrine was a death sentence. By the time a soldier worked his breech block and found a new round and reloaded, the target had already moved. And the target was also, very often, carrying a Winchester. The Army had spent 20 years preparing for a European-style engagement that never arrived on the frontier. And the cartridge they had built for it, powerful, precise, devastating in the right conditions, could not compensate for a rifle that fired once every 4 seconds against men who did not stand still. By 1892, the Army had its answer to the repeating rifle problem. The 30-40 Krag, a smokeless powder round in a Norwegian bolt-action magazine rifle, faster and flatter and capable of 5 rounds before reloading. The trapdoor was finished as a frontline arm. The Army wanted to move forward, and this was what forward looked like. 6 years later, on October 5, 1898, Major Melville Wilkinson led 77 soldiers of the 3rd U.S. Infantry across Leech Lake in northern Minnesota aboard 2 small steamboats, the Flora and the Chief of Duluth. They were carrying Krag rifles, not trapdoors. The Army had modernized. The mission was simple on paper: arrest 1 man. His name was Buganai Geshig. The Ojibwe called him Begone Gijig, hole in the sky. He had defied a federal court summons and escaped custody twice. Timber companies had been systematically stealing from the Leech Lake Reservation for years, setting fire to standing green timber so they could claim it as deadwood and buy it at pennies on the dollar. Ojibwe leaders had petitioned President McKinley directly in September 1898, writing that their pine lands were being taken through fraud and that the men responsible could not be checked. The federal government had responded by sending a marshal and a warrant. When that failed, they sent soldiers. The Ojibwe fighters in the tree line numbered somewhere around 20. Nobody knew exactly where they were. No one expected a fight. The soldiers stacked their Krags near the cabin at Sugar Point and began preparing their noon meal. Then a rifle went off. The Army later claimed it was an accident, a new recruit who forgot to set his safety. The Ojibwe accounts say a soldier fired on women in a canoe crossing the lake. What is certain is that within seconds, fire came from everywhere at once. The tree line erupted. The Ojibwe fighters were already positioned above and behind the soldiers, in terrain they had known since childhood. In cover the soldiers could not see into or through. The soldiers scrambled for their stacked weapons and tried to form skirmish lines around the perimeter of the cabin, but there was nothing to form a line against. There were muzzle flashes in the brush and the crack of Winchesters and the heavier thud of Krag fire going back into shadows. Wilkinson was hit in the arm and kept moving, hit in the leg and went down hard into the brush. His men dragged him back toward the cabin. The 3rd round, somewhere in the first terrible 30 minutes, found his abdomen. He was still alive that night, conscious enough to give orders, but the wound was past what any surgeon of 1898 could repair. A sergeant was shot through the brain. A private named Schwallenstocker, foraging for potatoes the following morning in the mistaken belief that the fighting was finished, walked out of cover and was killed in the field. Before the soldiers withdrew across Leech Lake 2 days later, 6 soldiers were dead, 10 were wounded, and 1 Indian policeman allied with the Army had been killed by mistake in the confusion. They never accomplished the arrest. They never saw most of the men who had been shooting at them. The Ojibwe fighters suffered no reported casualties, not one. The Army had done everything right by 1898 doctrine. New rifle, smokeless powder, magazine-fed bolt action. None of it mattered at 30 yards in the trees, against men who had grown up on that ground. The lesson the Army drew from the Indian Wars was not to go back to larger calibers. The institutional answer was magazine rifles and smokeless powder. And that was the right answer for the wars that followed, in Cuba, in the Philippines, in Europe, on the Pacific Islands, and in Korea. The Army kept moving towards smaller, faster, flatter. The 3006, the 308, the 556. Every generation of military cartridge was lighter than the last and faster than the last. And every generation was correct for the threat it was designed against. But the 4570's survival had nothing to do with institutional doctrine. It survived because the underlying problem it had been built to address was permanent. At close range, in dense cover against a target that will not stop, a large diameter heavy projectile carries an authority that lighter, faster rounds cannot match. By design. A 405-grain lead bullet at 458 inches does not depend on a precisely placed shot. It depends on contact. Frontier soldiers understood this. So did the hunters who refused to let the cartridge die. The 4570 government cartridge continued in service with the National Guard, Navy, and Marine Corps until 1897, 5 years after it was officially obsolete. Surplus trapdoor rifles were given to reservation Indians for subsistence hunting well into the 20th century because the Army had nothing else to do with them, and the round worked perfectly on deer. Then something stranger happened. The cartridge refused to die commercially. Hunters discovered that modern rifles, Marlin's Model 1895 lever action, the Ruger No. 1 single shot, could handle smokeless powder loads that pushed the old cartridge far beyond what any 19th century brass case could withstand. The same 405-grain projectile that left the trapdoor at 1,350 feet per second was now leaving modern actions at over 2,000. That produces more than 3,600 foot-pounds of energy at the muzzle. People who hunt in grizzly country carry it not for the average day in the field, but for the day the average doesn't apply. When something large and determined comes through brush at close range, and there is no time to wait and see if the first shot worked. In that moment, mass wins. A half-inch lead projectile at 3,600 foot-pounds is not a sporting choice. It is an engineering solution to a biology problem. The Navy and Coast Guard noticed something entirely different. They had a specific problem that no modern cartridge solved as neatly: line-throwing guns. When a ship needs to get a rescue line to another vessel or to shore in heavy weather, it uses a device that fires a projectile trailing a messenger line. The device has to be reliable in salt air, in spray, in cold, in the hands of sailors who are not riflemen. It needs a cartridge with enough power to carry the line a useful distance, simple enough to function in a break-open single-shot action, forgiving enough to work in conditions that would defeat something more refined. The military specification they settled on was the cartridge, caliber 45, line-throwing M32. A blank case derivative of the 4570 government. The current military document governing its specification carries a date of March 3, 2023. It is, at this moment, an active item in the United States Navy and Coast Guard. This is the dark reason the 4570 is still in service. Not because the military forgot to move on. Not because of sentiment or tradition. Because a .45 caliber case with the right charge behind it keeps solving problems that nothing else solves as simply or as reliably. It has been doing this for 150 years. As a war cartridge, as a hunting cartridge, as a line-throwing cartridge, and at no point in that span did the military ever fully close the file. The people who replaced it with something faster and lighter were right for the wars they were planning. The people who kept reaching for the old round were right about the wars that kept showing up uninvited. There is no contradiction in that. There is only the permanent gap between what doctrine prepares you for and what actually comes through the door. Every cartridge in every military arsenal represents a theory about the next war. The 4570 outlasted a dozen such theories. That tells you more about the nature of military thinking than any single battle in the round's history. If that's the kind of history that keeps you paying attention, the story underneath the standard account, where the weapons that should have been finished are still in somebody's hands for a reason, then stay with this channel. The stories that last longest are usually the ones the textbooks close too soon.